The universe is governed by entropy, an inescapable pull toward disorder. Life is the localized mechanism forced to repel that surrounding chaos. A living thing merges external sensory data with its own internal organization. Since an observer cannot occupy the same point in space and time, that private internal state makes the organism the only entity capable of performing its own biological computation. Making these biological predictions carries a severe energetic cost. To avoid dissipating back into the environment, the organism must continuously repay that deficit by extracting resources from its surroundings. We recognize this process when humans do it at scale, building infrastructure or extracting raw materials. We call it an economy. But human economies are a downstream expression of the exact same logic governing a single cell, choice made under the constraint of scarcity. This brings us to the eastern diamondback rattlesnake. By mass, it is the largest venomous snake in the Americas. It possesses a highly evolved defensive warning signal, its rattle. Yet when encountered, lifted, and manipulated by a researcher, this apex predator remains completely silent. A rattlesnake refusing to rattle appears to be a broken biological instinct. To understand why it remains silent, and to understand cooperation, perception, and subjective experience itself, we have to stop looking at it purely as an animal and view the organism strictly as an economic actor, reacting to scarcity. The physics and chemistry of the natural world set the rules, but they often leave a gap. A frog can hop left, or it can hop right, without violating any physical law. That underdetermined gap is a choice space, and a choice is simply a biological action where physical laws leave multiple outcomes available. Navigating this biological choice space is expensive. A predator sprinting across a valley burns massive amounts of calories. For the organism to oppose entropy and survive, that expenditure requires a subsequent caloric payoff that is greater than the cost. The organism must track energy draining from the system against the energy it expects to acquire. To capture a caloric benefit at all, it first has to draw a boundary, encapsulating the system eligible to receive the reward. That exact same boundary serves an inverse function. It demarcates the part of the world the organism cannot consume for energy. An animal cannot metabolize its own limb without destroying the organization it is trying to maintain. The boundary separating self from non-self functions as the minimum economic bookkeeping required for survival. It determines which gains to keep and marks the organism's own tissue as off-limits for consumption. Once that boundary is established, organisms often discover it does not simply encapsulate a single, discrete subject floating in a sea of alien objects. They detect degrees of themselves, discontinuities of their own form, in external entities. This is measured by allocentric self-form assignment, denoted as alpha. It measures how much of the organism is recognized in another entity. At 1, the other is fully self. At 0, a pure object. At -1, an absolute threat. The baseline state for the cells inside a healthy body is an alpha of nearly 1. Cancer occurs when this self-assignment collapses toward 0. Released from the internal economy, the cancer cell pursues its own replication, treating the surrounding healthy tissue as a pure, objective resource pile. Looking outward, the first variable in the alpha equation is R. This represents Hamilton's relatedness coefficient, the baseline genetic driver for kin selection. The insect order Hymenoptera, which includes ants and worker bees, formalizes this genetic economy. Because of their unique reproductive structure, a worker is mathematically more closely related to her sister workers than to her own mother. Acting in the interest of the colony directly promotes her own shared genetics. The second variable is phi, intraspecies self-extension, the recognition of self-form in genetically unrelated members of the same species. This builds non-kin economies, alliances, and human trade. The final variable is kappa, cross-species self-extension. Often dismissed as anthropomorphism, it is a highly evolved, selection-preserved mechanism. The biological pull toward another organism does not track invisible genetics because the physical substrate can't see DNA. It tracks phenotypic cues, appearance, eye contact, and social hierarchy. We see this perfectly preserved in the domestication of the dog. Ancient canids possessed pack structures and cooperative behaviors that triggered a familiar phenotypic match in human detection systems. Over thousands of years of reciprocal tolerance, the dog occupied a genuine economic niche within the human household. It performs labor, guarding, retrieving, and herding, and is compensated directly by a wage of food and shelter. Whether observing cells, siblings, or separate species, the rule holds. Whenever two bounded entities each evaluate the other's non-existence as a negative to themselves, an active economy is formed. Shared genetics are entirely optional. While these equations dictate who an organism cooperates with, a different set of rules governs its daily individual behavior. The Darwinian algorithm grants the organism freedom of action within certain lanes, but it systematically eliminates any choices that reliably kill the organism or its offspring. True freedom to originate one's own fundamental goals is completely withheld. These hardwired goals are Category B impositions. They are the fundamental drives, like hunger and the instinct for reproduction, that the organism is forced to serve. To acquire a new goal is to acquire a new hunger, paying in advance for a deficit you did not previously have. Evolutionary impositions drive the valuation machinery through a perceived deficit, a standing distance to target that demands constant and exhausting closure. You cannot pick an option your nervous system has not identified as best. Even if you attempt to prove your independence by intentionally slicing your finger, you are merely pursuing the satisfaction of disproving a hypothesis, presented to you in that moment as your highest benefit. Biological misbehavior is not driven by malice. It occurs because a survival goal is unmet, and the resulting energetic gap is intolerable. The laws of bioeconomics took charge and made the decision for the organism. This is the weak denial of free will. Applying this rigid economic framework of costs and imposed deficits allows us to solve the anomaly of the silent rattlesnake. In the 1990s, a biologist observing a timber rattlesnake swallowing a chipmunk noted that the snake rattled continuously for the entire duration of the encounter, risking predation to protect its caloric gain. The eastern diamondback, however, chooses total silence. Every act of rattling carries a marginal advantage, the benefit of one more warning signal to deter a large mammal and avoid a physical strike. Historically, this signal warned away roaming megafauna, but as large ungulate populations disappeared from the American landscape, the ancestral advantage of the rattling behavior collapsed toward neutrality. At the same time, rattling carries a strict marginal cost, the physical expenditure of energy, and the revelation of the snake's exact geographic position to potential threats. This chart shows the ancestral equilibrium, where the rising cost of energy depletion intersected with the falling advantage of deterrence. Natural selection programmed a baseline frequency of rattling. Then, a severe new cost variable entered the landscape. Humans systematically seek out and kill snakes that make noise. A rattlesnake that announces itself to a human does not deter a predator, it summons an executioner. This human-induced mortality violently spiked the marginal cost of every single rattle. The cost curve shifts abruptly upward, driving the optimal frequency of the signal radically down. The organism did not consciously calculate this math. The Darwinian algorithm computed it over generations. The snakes that survived to pass on their genes were the phenotypes operating at this new, quieter equilibrium. The rattlesnake has perfectly reallocated its signal budget to avoid death. Silence has become the optimal expenditure of its remaining resources. The snake allocating its signal budget to remain hidden, and a human observer allocating visual attention to find the snake are identical biological phenomena, viewed from opposite sides of the self-boundary. Both are governed by what is called the attentional manifold. This is the compiled machine code of bioeconomic equations that the organism actually experiences from the inside as reality. The attentional system does not construct a faithful, high-resolution map of the environment. Relevance precedes resolution. The manifold is a distorted geometric projection, warped heavily by the strict economics of staying alive. This graph shows the indefinite integral of attention. It represents the hard, crystallized outer boundary of what a specific species has a non-zero chance of noticing during its existence. Different species occupy entirely separate indefinite integrals. They can move through the exact same physical space while inhabiting completely different perceptual universes. A dog walking through a park is immersed in a dense, complex world of scent. That information exists objectively in the air, but it falls entirely outside the human boundary of awareness. But if a bird of prey suddenly swoops through the sky above, the dog's attention is violently yanked to the absolute outer limit of its indefinite integral, a domain it normally ignores, but which now holds immense survival weight. This graph charts the definite integral of attention. It tracks how a population actually distributes its finite budget of attention across the surface of its realm over a specific period of time. Physical objects that fall outside these illuminated clusters are not simply ignored by the organism. To the valuation machinery, they are functionally undefined. They do not exist. Because humans share an attentional manifold, we use language to point at the objects within it. These words act as a durable readout of our focus. By tracking word frequencies over decades, we can see exactly how a population's attention redistributes across the manifold. Subjective reality highlights threats and rewards based on evolutionary utility. This perceptual geometry is finite, bounded, and warped to prioritize fitness over objective truth. The mind, the biological boundary, and the economy are not separate disciplines. They are the same continuous thermodynamic reaction to scarcity, operating under a single rule: survival supersedes objective truth.